This lecture is on the communication process. The communication process is based on the fact that it takes more than one party in order for communication to take place. Communication doesn't just happen, and so we're going to look at how the process works, the various parts of it, and then we'll move and we'll talk about the communication process applied to several different facets of communication. But we'll get to that later. We begin here with this picture of the communication process. On the left, you have the source or the speaker. On the right, you have the receiver or audience. And then you have a whole lot of other words. So we're going to break this down to each different part. Across the top, you see channel with a message there in the middle. The bottom, you see going from left to right, or excuse me, right to left. Back to the original speaker, you see another channel there on the bottom. And that's what's called feedback. And then you have everything else. So let's break this down. Communication is a process. Here, it looks like a cycle. So as I just said, there on the left side, you had what's called the source or the speaker. The source or the speaker is where the message originates. It's the person or entity that begins the conversation. I say entity. So it's the party that begins the conversation. Maybe one person, it may be several, depending on the context of the communication. But the source or the speaker is where the message originates. The receiver is the audience, the one that takes delivery of the message. So, if it was me talking to you, I would be the sender. If I began the conversation, you would be the receiver. Then we have what's called the message. I'm skipping down here to the message. The message is the content of what the speaker is saying. So it's in this conversation here, it's about the communication process and explaining all of that information. That's the message. Encoding, to go back up to that one, encoding is how the message is phrased. So the word choice is made to elicit an understanding of the message. Decoding, the very last one there, is the interpretation of the speaker's words. So it's you taking the words you hear from me, listening to them, and understanding them in a specific way. That's decoding. Most misunderstandings occur in encoding and decoding of the speaker's message. So I may choose words poorly to help you understand something. I may use terms or phrases that you're unfamiliar with, and so when you decode, you may not fully understand what I'm saying. That's how encoding and decoding errors can commonly occur. And there's a whole lot of other things that can cause encoding and decoding error. Feedback is the audience's response to the message. So if you recall back to the picture, across the top you had the channel and the message. Across the bottom you had the channel carrying what's called feedback. So the feedback is really the audience's message back to the original speaker. So feedback is the response to the message. Feedback can come in two forms, either verbal or nonverbal. Or I guess it could come in a third form of both. A verbal response would just be language. A nonverbal response is non-linguistic. If it's a face-to-face interaction, you're typically going to have at least nonverbal, if not verbal as well. But if it's something that's just plain text, it will be verbal only, just language. The channel dictates how that feedback is communicated. So the channel is the vehicle that carries the message. So in this case, it's an audio recording along with a visual in the form of a PowerPoint. That's the channel, so electronic media. In public speaking, it's literally air and sound waves, although it's often known as a face-to-face channel. The channel is the vehicle that carries the message. Noise is any interference to the message, getting from point A to point B or from point B back to point A. 3 different types of noise include environmental, physiological, and psychological noise. Environmental noise is a literal sound, something that impedes the ability for us to process the words. So it may be you're trying to have a conversation with somebody face to face, but there's some other loud talking going on next to you or out in the hallway. It could be somebody's cell phone ringing and interrupting the conversation. In this particular day and time, it could be someone's wearing a mask covering up their face, and it's hindering your ability to hear what they're saying. That's all part of environmental noises. Physiological noises have something to do with the body. Physiological, having to do with the body. Okay, so this could be a hearing impairment. If someone is hard of hearing, then that would be a physiological noise, something within the body that's keeping them from being able to process the sound of the speaker's message or of the feedback. It may not be something that's permanent either. It could be just you're sick. A lot of times whenever you're ill, it becomes more difficult to listen and process, and that's a physiological noise. Psychological noises are things like biases. You hear something that you disagree with, and so you instantly start mentally arguing with someone. That's a psychological noise. Or they say something that makes you angry or makes you sad or makes you really excited, and you start thinking about other things. That's an emotional noise, so psychological in nature. Other preoccupations sometimes make it difficult for us to process information as well, whether it's daydreaming or we're thinking about a test coming up in our next class or who knows what all else, but something that is psychologically distracting us. Psychological noises are noises that only you can hear. You can think of it that way. It's only going to distract you. It's only within the head of the listener. Here we have 2 more concepts that are a bit more obscure. You have what's called shared meaning. Shared meaning simply means that the sender and the receiver have a mutual understanding of the message. So they're on the same page. They equally understand what it is that the speaker came here to share. That's what shared meaning is. And typically speaking, that is the goal of all communication, is to reach shared meaning with the audience. Then we have context. Context, this one's tricky. You break the word down. Con means with. Text here means the situation. And context is wide-reaching. As you can see on the slide, it includes a variety of things. Could be influences on the speaker, audience, or the occasion. So recent events on campus or in the news or personal experiences, those are all things that build into our communication as to why we think the way we do, why we speak the way we do, why we're talking about the things we're talking about. But in a more general sense, context is better answered by answering the questions, where am I, and what is the expectation for my communication? So how am I supposed to talk here? How am I supposed to behave? How am I supposed to interact with these people? This is the reason why you behave differently around your boss at work than you do your friends. This is why you behave differently with your significant other than you do with your college professor or your parents. It's because of context. What is it that's built into that relationship that has established how we communicate? That's context. Then we have in communication a goal. A goal is what you hope to accomplish by the end of the speech or the conversation, whatever it is. And goals can be formal or informal. A lot of times our goals, they're mental. We don't really have an established outcome that we can measure. So outcome is the next term there. the formal or informal confirmation of accomplishment of a goal. In some cases, we can measure a formal outcome. In other cases, we can't. In a lot of public speaking contexts, we have no formal measurement of our outcome. But in, say, something like a class or a workshop in the workplace, you may be called on to demonstrate what you learned from the communication experience. And then that demonstration is measured in a certain way, like, say, an exam. And how you did on that exam measures how well the speaker accomplished their goal. It's one example of measured outcome. Next, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about what's called the facets of communication. Facets, that just means different parts of. So a diamond has many facets. So different angles and different ways of looking at it. Okay, so in communication, there are many facets. We have 4 that we're going to discuss today. There's at least one more, probably more than that. We're going to talk about just 4. The first one is called dyadic communication or interpersonal communication. Dyadic communication is just 2 people having a conversation, one-on-one. The second one is called small group communication, and that's what it sounds like. Several people communicating with each other where all are present and can be seen by one another and respond directly to the conversation. Typically, we're going to consider one person speaking at a time within this small group. The third facet is mass communication. This occurs between a speaker and a relatively large group of people that is most often unseen by the speaker. So the audience and the speaker are in 2 different places. So if you want to think about things like radio and television, the nightly news broadcast, that's an example of mass communication. I have an example here on the slide about political rallies. That's an example. You have something like the Democratic National Convention, where you have tens of thousands of people all in one arena. The speakers get up and talk, and they have a planned address, and they don't deviate from that address, just like somebody who was just talking to a television camera would. They have a planned address, and they don't deviate from it. Because of the size of the crowd at that political rally, they don't have the ability to interact with that audience. That's what you're looking at. That's why it would be considered mass communication. The fourth facet is everyone's favorite, or at least mine, and this is public speaking. Public speaking is where a speaker delivers a message with a specific purpose to an audience that is present, that is physically present. That's a paramount part of public speaking. It's absolutely important that you understand that public speaking has to take place with an audience that is present. Because the audience needs to be there so that they can give feedback and attention to the speaker. That'll become important here in a minute. We've already talked about feedback, but we're going to turn right around and talk about it again in each of these 4 facets of communication. So when it comes to public speaking and dyadic and small group and mass communication, one thing that makes them different from each other is the opportunities for feedback. That'll be important for you to remember. Opportunities for feedback. With dyadic or interpersonal communication, feedback opportunity is immediate. It's right away. Because if you're having a one-on-one conversation with somebody and you lose them, they don't understand what you're talking about, they're gonna stop you and say, okay, you lost me. Or you're going to see that look of confusion on their face. And because it's one-on-one, your attention's not split with anyone else, and you're going to see the nonverbals immediately. You're going to take turns immediately back and forth. for your communication, so that give and take, that feedback is immediate. Small group communication, the feedback is considered near immediate because it's expected that people are going to take turns. And they may stop you, they may interject or interrupt if something is completely misunderstood or completely disagreed with. So there's social protocol dictates in a small group environment, we're typically going to take turns. So verbal communication is slowed down a little bit, but so is nonverbal communication, because you can't look at everybody all at once. Even if you're sitting around a round table like King Arthur, you're still going to be looking at the right side of the table instead of the left or something like that. And so you can't see everybody all at once, and you may miss a look or an expression or a hand raised or something like that. There's a little bit of lag in small group communication. This is why it's called near immediate feedback. Then we have mass communication. And in mass communication, the feedback is what's called post-responsive feedback. This is the most complicated. Post-responsive feedback means after the fact. So in mass communication, responses come after the message is delivered, and then you wait. So things like TV ratings, or maybe an easier to understand example is an advertising campaign. So on Sunday, you pick up a newspaper, and in that newspaper, you have a list of sales circulars, a whole bunch of them that come with that paper. That is a message sent to you by that department store or whatever it was. That message is, hey, this is on sale, come in and buy it. Now, how does that company measure if that message was understood? They measure it by seeing if the amount of sales of that particular item increased after the fact. And so then they measure whether or not their communication was effective, if they need to change their strategy or if their strategy is working. So they send the message in the form of that sales circular, then they wait for participation. That's the communication back, but it takes time. That's why it's a slow process in mass communication, post-responsive feedback. And then our fourth facet, public speaking. Here, things get a little bit more complicated again, because in public speaking, feedback is considered immediate, just like with dyadic communication. But in public speaking, you have one speaker and then a whole host of other people involved. That large group of people is the audience. Now, here's the main difference. Typically with public speaking, you have the speaker up in front of and facing an entire audience. So they have a pretty good view of everyone all at once. Or at least they have a feel for how the audience at large is responding. So the feedback, whereas you may occasionally have some verbal feedback, it's typically very limited. If you ask a specific audience member a direct question for them to answer, they may answer it. But otherwise, we typically, in public speaking, do not expect audience participation in a verbal manner. We expect nonverbal feedback. Nonverbal feedback is very quick. So whether that's blank stares or yawns or a crowd leaning forward and nodding because they're interested, eye contact, those are all parts of nonverbal communication. A good public speaker is going to watch for that nonverbal feedback and is going to adjust accordingly. If they look bored, the speaker should spice things up a little bit, get a little more energetic, try to engage the audience on a different level. If they seem like they're really into what the speaker is saying, the speaker should just continue on doing what they're doing. So that adjustment is very important. Again, that's why it's important for the audience to physically be in front of the speaker. We're going to look at just a couple of more added things here about public speaking. A lot of people approach classes like this one with some fear about public speaking, and that's understandable, but I always like to encourage people to draw on what they're already good at. Some people in this class are going to be great conversationalists. I've had students tell me year after year that they're fine sitting and talking to a perfect stranger for hours, but you put them up in front of a class, they get shy. Well, it's because the context is different, but it doesn't mean you can't use those conversational skills. It's the best kind of conversation, right? It's a one-sided conversation. Talk to the audience like you would talk to that perfect stranger. Humor is also something that can be useful as long as it's something that is a skill of yours. And I say that, and people usually are a little confused by it. Only use humor if you're good at it. Because what happens sometimes is if you're not good at humor, you might tell a joke and it falls flat on its face. And that's very awkward and difficult to overcome as a speaker until you're used to that kind of thing. So I usually suggest people shy away from it unless they know that they're good at humor. And always the humor needs to be appropriate for the context. Some of you are also going to be really good at writing papers. You start with an outline, you fill in all of your paragraphs, your major body points, and so on and so forth, like you would writing an English paper. Writing a speech is very similar. We're not going to write it all out completely. We're going to use what's called extemporaneous speaking, so we're going to use outlines. But that's that bare bones part of writing a paper. So if you're good at writing papers, chances are you're going to do all right in preparing your speeches. Use that skill. As we get into speaking, some other things you're going to need to be aware of is culture. We live in a very culture-sensitive time, and so we need to be aware of those things. Culture is a learned set of ideas and norms and standards. So our cultural differences may be based on language, beliefs, values, norms, or behaviors. And so you need to be aware that there are differences and be sensitive to those. Ethnocentrism is the belief that your cultural values are superior to all others. And it's not an effective communication tool. Not something that you want to use within your speeches. Cultural intelligence is kind of the opposite of that ethnocentrism. Cultural intelligence is knowing that there are differences in cultures and being flexible to those differences. And that's something that we should all continue to work on and get better at.